Most of double-frame locomotives disappeared in the early 1930s, but a nominally new class was created from two older designs to form the 3200 class, or Duke Dogs. This engine, Earl of Berkeley and City of Truro, are the only survivors of these types, and were to be seen together once again in 1989. On the locomotive, the cramped and unprotected nature of the footplate crew's accommodation is well seen. Even the last G.W.R. tender engines didn't have as much protection as their contemporaries on other railways. City of Truro is naturally owned by the National Railway Museum York and is permitted to run on British Rail's main lines as seen here. Today, it's restricted to 60 miles an hour. The engine hasn't had very many outings on the main line, as in deference to its age and importance, it's limited to shortish trains, which are not as economic to run as longer trains. The 400 series also incorporates a group of 060 tank engines known as pannier tanks because of the way the water tanks are slung over the boiler. Although seen here on a freight train on the Dart Valley Railway, these were passenger engines. Three survive today, and the West Somerset example is seen more conventionally on a passenger train. The final development of the pannier tank genre also occupies the 400s, the 34, 84 and 9400 tanks, built from 1947 onwards. Number 3409 was the very last steam engine built to a pre-nationalisation design, going into service in October 1956. In 1959, the first was scrapped. Such was the pace of change. Two survived. Number 9466, illustrating the Great Western's association with the London Underground, who bought a number of ex-Great Western panniers out of BR service and used them until 1972. These 9400s were the nearest to a churchward pattern of pannier tank, with a cone boiler and no dome. long line of tank engines in West Wales introduces the next class, the 500 series of small prairies. These standard Churchward locomotives were smaller versions of the 4100 series of prairies, the name given to a locomotive with a single axle at front and rear, and 3 driving axles, a 262. These small prairies fell into 3 categories. The earliest had 4 feet 1.5 inch driving wheels and were a little restricted in their use. The main production batches had 6-inch larger drivers and were divided into 2 types, the earlier ones having flat tops to their side tanks, and the later 4575 series having sloping tanks which held more water for an increased working range. They were very useful machines, able to work over most lines, and were at home on all types of work. This is one of the earlier batch, many of which have been preserved. It's seen at work on the West Somerset Railway, and may be compared to the later style of 5272, another Didcot locomotive, seen on loan to the Llangollen Railway. Note the higher side tanks. Another of the earlier series illustrates freight working. The number plate on the smoke box door indicates that this is in British Railways livery. These were added by BR, the G.W.R showing its numbers by painting them on the front buffer beam. Another good strain is seen behind a predominantly passenger type, the 1600 pannier tank, also in BR livery. These were the smallest of the pannier tank classes, all built under British Railways auspices. This is the only survivor. .26, 36 and 4600s didn't survive long after the war, but 56 and 6600 tanks did. These were 062 tanks, especially built for use in Wales. They did, however, stray to other parts of the system, especially the Birmingham area, where they performed both freight and passenger duties. With a carrying axle only at the rear, they perhaps ran more effectively in reverse. Their true home was South Wales, where they replaced a myriad of designs of 062 tanks, inherited by the G.W.R in 1922 from the Welsh Valleys Railways. There were as many different railways and locomotive types as there were valleys, and the G.W.R's strict standardization policy only went some way to eliminating the characteristics of the coalfield railways. As the 5600s didn't look like any other type of Great Western engine, with their excessive front overhang, they actually preserved the different feel of South Wales. Quite a few are preserved, and 6619 is seen rather far from home, but still in a steep valley, on the North Yorkshire Moors Railway. The other extreme, Great Western liveried 5619, is seen on the Isle of Purbeck's railway with green Southern Region-style coaches. Also on the Isle of Purbeck is a 5700 pannier tank, an example of the most numerous class of Great Western engine. This locomotive is also the most travelled in preservation, being owned by Birmingham's Tyseley Museum, who've loaned it out to various railways, including the G.W.R. These panniers, of which 863 were built, more than any other type of British locomotive, must really be the characteristic Great Western engines. With the similar-looking 6400 and 1600 types, they constituted nearly 30% of G.W.R. stock. The panniers covered all duties. Here, a typical freight is headed by Tyseley's second engine, 7760. One pannier achieved fame after its service days. 5775 was used in the Railway Children film, in a fictional sand-coloured livery reproduced in 1990 to celebrate 20 years since the film was made. There was only one major variant in the outline of the panniers, the shape of the cab. The later engines, two of which are seen here in 1965, had a more rounded cab than the preserved examples we've seen before. This is seen to better effect on 9789, seen shunting at Oxford near the end of steam. These engines were used for all types of duties, although shunting and short-haul freights were their main areas of work. A very small subclass of 12 had a further variation, with condensing apparatus and cut-back tanks for use through underground tunnels in London. Their work took them all over the G.W.R. system, this pair being seen in South Wales with a freight train over the former Brecon and Merthyr Railway.